I'm back on this Sunday, having time to do another program. I think some people are interested. I'm continuing with a reflection on the Gospel of John, uh, and today, for sure, trying to inspire myself with the Word of God and dealing with a subject that I did deal with extensively, which is the so called cleansing of the temple. The image you see here is a beautiful cross given to me in Mexico by a dear Dominican friend, priest, scholar, with whom I corresponded for 4 decades probably. He died a few years ago in his early 60s, and so I wanted to mention him. I've decided to go with the King James as being more literal and more appropriate for my purposes and an approach. So that we had been talking about Cana last time. I think it was session 4. Uh, and now we're going to talk about the so-called purification, cleansing of the temple. Now, I did my dissertation in Mark, where it is really the opposite of a purification. In fact, it can be said to be not just a portent of the destruction of the temple. So what Mark narrates in chapter 11, 2 chapters later in chapter 13, verse 2, it says that not a stone upon a stone will remain that will not be destroyed of all these wonderful buildings. And if you read more in chapter 13 of Mark, you have the desolation, the abomination of the desolation standing where he ought not, etc., which is commonly taken to be a desecration of the temple as narrated in the books of Maccabees. In the books of Maccabees, you have a true purification of the temple after a defilement using the Greek word katharismos. And what I have done, I think one of the maybe more original things in my dissertation is to show that this is not the one, that 7 elements that can be identified in the books of Maccabees regarding a temple cleansing. These 7 elements can be found in reverse in the Gospel of Mark, so that you know this is an excerpt that can be found on my website regarding these 7 elements that are found, I think, in reverse in Mark. So, as far as that goes, each of the 4 accounts of an action that Jesus did in the temple differ. I think the original one is Mark, and one of the conclusions I came to in my dissertation is that the magnitude of the event is inversely proportional to its historicity, or vice versa. In other words, only something very minor might have happened if Jesus overturned tables which were set up during Passover time to exchange money into currency acceptable by the temple, namely the Tyrian shekel with a higher grade of silver in fulfillment of Exodus 30, the temple tax, half a shekel, etc. So that, whether Jesus did anything in the temple or not, it goes unobserved by any sources outside of the Gospels. When Paul supposedly brings in people to the temple in Acts 21 who are not supposed to be there, a riot takes place. The temple, especially during Passover, had what they call the flowers of the priesthood, young bucks policing the temple, and there's no report of Jesus doing anything disruptive in the temple. It's not adduced in his trial before the Sanhedrin, where the accusation, on the other hand, is we heard him say, I will destroy this man-made or handmade temple, and in 3 days another one not handmade I will build. A perfect chiasm, X-shaped saying, sounds very, Jewish and even Jesus. So you have, I will destroy a handmade temple, and in 3 days another one not handmade, corresponding handmade, not handmade. I will destroy, I will build. And that is the accusation, which of course is then repeated as a mockery on the cross. Woe, you who are, really, you could say with a present participle, here and now, building, destroying and building, because Jesus is the new temple, as represented in the Gospels. So you have, I think Bossuet and some other scholars thought that a saying of Jesus that not a stone upon a stone would remain on the temple, that would not be destroyed, is turned into an action in Mark, where he hyperbolically casts out everyone, buyers and sellers. Luke limits it to shushing out just sellers, doesn't overturn any tables. Matthew follows Mark also and does a couple of different things there. And now we have to deal with John. But in Mark, the very line, not a stone upon a stone, would of course remind us of the language in Haggai, the prophet, which is all about rebuild the temple so that your fortunes will change. In other words, Haggai is all about the need for the returned Jews from exile to, instead of concentrating on their own houses and their own things, to rebuild the house of God, which is going to take place from 520 to 515 BCE or BC. And that's what scholars today would call the beginning, or more or less, of the Second Temple period, after the first temple built by Solomon, almost 400, years before, 900 or so. And so that when Jesus says not a stone upon a stone will remain, or when Mark says that in Jesus' mouth in Mark 13:2, he's really pointing ahead 40 years to AD 70, and that would be the end of the Second Temple period. It's very interesting. But there you have a total focus on the destruction of this temple that, with all due respect to the Jews, of course, in the Gospel of Mark, it's presented basically as something no longer needed, because Jesus heals lepers and women with blood flows and things like that, and there is no need to sell animals or pigeons if you're poor, etc., because the actual kofar or expiation price, ransom, uh, that was necessary in Exodus legislation is Jesus himself, who will give his life as a ransom for many, Mark 10:45. A lutron instead of lutra, but plural versus singular, but nevertheless, the idea is that it is Jesus who pays the real tribute necessary to, in a way, really finish the Exodus, because this is like a toll tax. I have all this in my Mark notes, on the website. Um, there are notes for biblical courses, and if you saw the I guess the table of contents, uh, doesn't quite point that out on the table of contents, but nevertheless I deal with the Exodus 30 temple tax as the price for every Israelite crossing into the promised land in this first Exodus. So anyway, as far as Luke, there is no such accusation against Jesus that he's going to destroy the temple. He just shushed out some people, as we said, the sellers only. That accusation is transposed or transferred to Stephen in Acts 6:7. As if Stephen is saying that Jesus, who's now dead and risen, is the one that's going to destroy the temple. They're accusing Stephen of saying that about Jesus and change the customs that Moses handed down to us. So what you've got here with the temple is a real topic of, um, Jesus is the new temple in Christianity. For the rabbis, the Pharisees were not as closely linked to the temple as were the Sadducees, who disappeared with the destruction of the temple. The Pharisees and their successors, the rabbis, seem to be quite happy with a Torah focused religion where the temple is of great interest, but which will not be rebuilt until Messiah comes. So that both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism are sort of happy without a building that's the temple where animals are sacrificed. So, with that as a little bit of a background, we're saying that Mark 11 contains a narration of an action of Jesus, which seems to be a portent of the destruction of the temple. And as I said in my dissertation, the uniquely Markan phrase that he would allow no one to carry a vessel through the temple, not anything or something like that, but a vessel. I think it's a temple vessel, such as blood carrying vessels for sacrifices, etc. So I call what Jesus does in Mark an infarct, a heart attack that he causes the temple to have. And the interpretive guideline for that, made very clear by a Telford in his dissertation, The Barren Fig Tree or something, is that in Mark uniquely, the temple act is flanked by the first part of the fig tree episode. Jesus tries to find fruit on a leafy fig tree, not being the kairos or the appropriate season or moment for figs. Then he does the temple act where he casts out everyone, buyers and sellers, a totality, endiades in Greek they call it. Then he catastrophizes the tables of the money changers and dove sellers, using this word catastrophe, overturn, which is used in the Old Testament for the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah. It's a very graphic destruction word. And then he would allow no one to transport a vessel. And then he teaches that my house shall be called a house of prayer, not sacrifice, for all nations, Isaiah 56. But you have turned it into a cave of bandits, Jeremiah 7, which is all about the destruction of this place, this temple, and the desolation of the city, etc. The whole initial speech of Jeremiah, I think, in Jeremiah 7, it's about the destruction of the temple. So that's kind of like a background. So what does John do? John, just as he has the Barabbas episode where they exchange a false son of the father, Barabbas, true revolutionary, for Jesus, true Son of God, falsely accused revolutionary, and the multiplication of the loaves. John also, who doesn't always follow the synoptics in everything for sure. I said no transfiguration, etc. But he does have an action in the temple. We're going to see what the action seems to indicate in the Gospel of John. So that in the Gospel of John, right after this first sign that we discussed yesterday, the turning of water into wine at a wedding feast, where the eschatological events are unleashed and Jesus' hour is prodded on by his mother, the new Eve, we see that the Passover was at hand or near, and this is the first mention of Passover in this gospel. It'll mention 3 Passovers, where we get the notion that Jesus had a 3-year ministry. And so he goes up to Jerusalem and found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves. So it's not just doves like in Mark. These are big animals. Just like the arrest of Jesus includes reference to a Roman cohort, hundreds of soldiers, and they fall to the ground when Jesus says, I am. If we continue with this with God's grace, we'll get to that I am saying and all that kind of stuff. But here you have a major disruption. And this is where the famous image of Jesus making a scourge of small cords, he drove them all out of the temple. Now, the temple during Passover time was, according to Josephus, I think he says millions or something. It was hugely crowded, and it would be impossible for this literally to be exact. So he casts out all these merchants in the temple. There's no reference really to just the buyers actually. So you could start looking at this as a anti-commerce thing, of which I think there's no sign in Mark that it's anti-commerce in the temple. There's a whole debate I covered in my dissertation about whether a certain marketplace should have been farther out, or they should have gone there to buy their animals. The counter argument being that the closer to the temple you buy the animals, like in the court of Gentiles or some outer court, the less of a chance of a defective or injured animal. They had to be perfect, unblemished. So the anti-commerce idea, which is quite popular among many people that Jesus was against the church being involved in commerce. He could well have been against that, but we have to study these temple passages for what they seem to be indicating. And yes, in the Gospel of John, you do have don't make my Father's house an emporium or a marketplace. Um, so, trying to get this line here a little bit better. I don't know how this happens, but anyway. In any case, you have a reference to don't make my Father's house a marketplace. And the idea, I think, is going to be found in a very important chapter of Zechariah. So that if we went to Zechariah 14, the last chapter of Zechariah, the last verses basically of Zechariah are that, in fact, the end time in Zechariah is described as all the nations coming to Jerusalem to celebrate Sukkot, which is going to end tomorrow night, tomorrow evening. So we're in the middle of Sukkot right now, Feast of Booths. And it says that on that day, even the horses' bells will be consecrated to the Lord, as will be the, guess pots and pans, etc. And there shall be no more merchant in the house of the Lord of hosts on that day. So that's the end of Zechariah, which can be seen as an original Zechariah, chapters 1 through 8, then very much more eschatological and messianic entry Zechariah, chapters 9 through 11. Look on him whom they, well, that would be a little later, but strike the shepherd, etc. And then you have chapters 12, 13, and 14 of Zechariah, which would be, prayer in Jerusalem and a fountain and lamentation for one whom they have pierced, or maybe it's a plural. I'm reading the Jewish Study Bible and learning of alternative textual readings for that. But the point being that this is quite eschatological, and I adhere to the view that Zechariah 9 through 11 circulated as a Massah oracle. That's the first word, is Massah or oracle. Then Zechariah 12 to 14, another unit that was circulating under the title or non-title oracle Massah. So these two units were added on to Zechariah 1 through 8. And then a third unit circulating with the title Massah becomes the book of Malachi from the My Messenger line in Malachi. So my point is that we're in eschatological end of days situation here, and you have this idea that there shall be no merchant or Canaanite or trader in my Father's house. And his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will eat me up, or will devour me. Look at the King James says, hath eaten me up, comedit me. And this is from Psalm 69, which is considered to be, in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary, the most quarried psalm for the Passion of Jesus. So we're in strictly passion territory here. Zeal for your house will consume me. from Psalm 69, verse 10. And so these are the things that are going into this rendition of the action in the temple. That's what I called it in my dissertation on Mark. Here you can easily call it a purification of the temple, but it's better to sort of be more neutral as to what is being talked about here. So then the Jews answered him and said to him, "What sign do you show us that you do these things?" So this is very interesting because in the Gospel of Mark, what they ask Jesus about is with what exousia you do this, or who gave you this exousia to do this. Exousia being a word that in Latin can be translated potestas. It's the ability in Greek to act unhindered by law or physics. It's the ability to do something without any obstacle. That's the word used for the total exousia given to one like a son of man in Daniel 7. 3 times. That's the authority. I don't think it's the best translation, but there's no other words in English. I'm going to say his dominion. He spoke with dominion, not like the scribes and Pharisees when Jesus expels the first demon in Mark 1. He spoke with exousia. So exousia is an important word. John uses it for the good shepherd. He has exousia to give his life and to take it back up again. And I think we're going to see exousia in chapter 5 of John. But the interesting thing is that John is changing the question about with what exousia authority you do this into his language of what sign do you show that you can do these things, or that you do these things, or by which you do these things. Quia hec facis. And the answer is that Jesus says to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it," not build it. So that the accusation in Mark that he's going to destroy the temple, Mark 14, transferred to Stephen episode in Acts 6 or 7, is now transformed in John into an offer by Jesus for them to destroy this temple, meaning his body, so that he can raise it in 3 days. And in typical Johannine fashion, his opponents, which are referred to as the Jews often in this gospel, which I want to take pains to explain that these are all Jews arguing among themselves. And for Christians today, or for so many, centuries, to look at it as Jesus against the Jews or the Jews against Jesus is completely getting it very unfortunately wrong and dangerously misunderstood. It still takes some effort to clear it up, but nevertheless, they're all Jews. Jesus is a Jew. He speaks to the Samaritan woman in chapter 4. "I'm a Jew. Salvation is from the Jews." Samaritan woman says, "How can you, a Jew?" etc. So the Jews understanding this as a reference to the physical temple, which was under construction, had been under construction for 46 years, which is a very interesting Johannine data, because the massive rebuilding of the temple started by Herod the Great, probably to ingratiate himself with the real Jews in a way, because he was an Edomite or Idumean, recently converted and considered kind of a half breed or half Jew or something. He had started rebuilding the temple massively, one of the seven wonders of the world, I think, 20 BC. So if you jump forward 46 years, you're in 26 AD. And that's a great date or great year for the start of Jesus' ministry, which will end 3 years later, 29 AD, which I think is the date he died, the year he died, having been born 4 BC, and then therefore being 33 years of age, which is what the tradition says. But he spake of the temple of his body. He was speaking about the temple of his body. And in this is not the only time, maybe the first time, that Jesus says something that the disciples will only understand when he's risen from the dead. So they remember these things. They kind of keep them in their heart, so to speak. And they remembered and believed the scriptures and the word that Jesus had told them. So that you have here a very, very interesting transformation of probably we could trace it as a saying that the temple will be destroyed. That he would not be the first Jew to say that. Jeremiah said it in chapter 7. Amos speaks about it in chapter 9, and others may have spoken similarly. That saying may have become this temple action in Mark, and then it is assumed or taken up by John and made into a direct reference to Jesus, the new temple that will arise in the resurrection after 3 days. And it's not that Jesus threatened to destroy the Jewish temple. The Romans are going to do that 40 years in the future, but rather that they are going to destroy him, the temple, and he will raise it up in 3 days. So you have a whole kind of teaching there about Jesus vis-a-vis the Jewish religion. He is bringing and is being presented as bringing a different kind of worship, a different kind of worship. I mean, that's what the dialogue in John 4 says. The dispute there is between the Samaritan position that they should worship on Mount Gerizim or something, and the Jewish position that only in Jerusalem is God to be worshipped in a temple. And Jesus tells them that the hour is coming, and we are now in it, in which the true worshipers of the Father will worship in spirit and truth, because thus the Father wants that he be adored. God is spirit, and those who worship him should worship in spirit and truth. So that this is the argument of this gospel, obviously, caused a bitter debate in Judaism. And I've mentioned before that probably you still have a situation when this gospel was first written where many believers in Jesus, to one extent or another. Remember, I spoke about when you go to the circus, I've never done it, but I've seen it, I guess. You hit something that makes a ball go up and maybe hit the bell if you go all the way, but you could be, just halfway or a quarter way or whatever. You have that kind of faith in Jesus reflected in this gospel. I think you have Raymond Brown's The Community of the Beloved Disciple as a very important book on the various positions or factions in regards to Jesus, not all black and white or for and against or something. Here you have the idea that Jesus is the new temple where you worship God. And I forgot something that I was going to say, I guess. But the important thing, I think, is that we have a sense here of how the fourth gospel transforms theological things that are circulating and puts them in its own fashion. So he was in Jerusalem during the day of the Passover feast, and many believed in his name. This is very Johannine, seeing his signs that he was doing. But Jesus himself did not really believe them because he knew everyone, and that he didn't need anyone to give testimony about him because he knew what was in man. That's kind of somewhat obscure. A constant theme will be the misunderstanding of Jesus. In John 7, his brothers don't believe in him, etc. And they're kind of prodding him to do this or that or the other. But Jesus is above all that. And so, yes, I was saying that in this gospel, what you have is a situation where many believers in Jesus are still attached to the synagogue. And as this belief in Jesus spreads and who Jesus is becomes more and more notorious, not that he wasn't already somewhat notorious as a crucified messianic pretender, whom the high priests didn't like, and maybe the Pharisees didn't like his eating and breaking, halakhic rules regarding who to eat with and how to tithe and how to wash and all these other things that will prevail in Judaism, especially after the destruction of the temple when rabbinic Judaism takes over and a pluralism that existed previously is largely gone. You still have Jewish dissidents, Karaites, etc. But basically speaking, like in the Catholic Church, you get more of a monolithical faith with less room for pluralism. This bitter, controversy about Jesus will result, I think, in this blessing of the heretics or curse of the heretics, where if you went to synagogue and you believed in Jesus, and you were asked to pronounce this curse against believers in Jesus or heretics, it would be a curse upon yourself. That would be a very good way of weeding out crypto believers in Jesus. Speaking of which, we're going to get to a crypto believer in Jesus next time, which is Nicodemus. I didn't necessarily plan that, but what I'm saying is that it's a bitter situation, and we should be aware of that. And as Jesus rises above some of these murmurings and petty, maybe not so petty squabbles, we today, and I want to make this clear, should understand where people come from. We should understand what the Gospel of John says in chapter 9. We know God spoke to Moses. We don't know about you, Jesus. So if we understand that, we can respect and admire and love those who are faithful to what Moses said. Understanding at the same time without flattening out, that's a N.T. Wright kind of word, without eliminating the differences. Jacob Neusner, great, rabbinic scholar who was in Florida, he may have died already, maybe really old. He has a book dedicated, I think, to Cardinal Ratzinger, and I think it's the one that's a rabbi speaks to Jesus. And he talks about Christian Jewish dialogue nonsense when people are not clear as to what they believe and try to wishy-washy water it down with a complex or something. I don't want to offend this or offend that. Well, it's better to speak the truth and to be respectful rather than to invent something kind of like politically correct or something. The important thing is to be clear as to what texts say, to be clear as to how you interpret or apply them or use them, and to be clear that, especially in regards to Jews, we should have incredible admiration and love and repentance for how these texts and the beliefs that they issued in played such a horrible role, totally against Jesus, who never threatened anybody. I mean, Jeremiah might have threatened some of his enemies, but Jesus, you say, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing when they're crucifying him, Romans. So that he's not a reason to hate Jews. On the contrary, properly understood biblical studies is, I think, one of the greatest uniters of Christians and Jews, or Jews and Christians, etc. So, having dealt with in 42 minutes or so this temple act in John, and I'm sure so other things could have been, said. I'm going to not take any longer and stop there.